Close your eyes and let the gentle sound of Mediterranean waves carry you back through time, back to when empires dreamed beneath star-filled skies and ambition moved as slowly as the tides. Tonight, we journey to an age when the world was younger, when two great civilizations faced each other across waters that sparkled like scattered diamonds under ancient moons. The Punic Wars. 3 conflicts spanning over a century weren't just battles between Rome and Carthage. They were the moments when the very foundations of our modern world were laid, stone by careful stone. The laws that govern us, the languages we speak, the roads we travel, even the way we think about citizenship and belonging, all echo with whispers from these ancient shores. Imagine the twilight hours when Roman senators walked marble halls, their sandals soft against polished stone, while across the sea, Carthaginian merchants counted silver coins by lamplight. Neither could know that their struggles would shape empires yet unborn, cities yet unbuilt, ideas yet unthought. So subscribe for more journeys through history's gentle currents, and tell us in the comments which ancient civilization calls to your restful spirit. Tonight, let us drift back to when the Mediterranean was young, and 2 great powers began their eternal dance. In the soft light of dawn, 8 centuries before Christ walked the earth, the Mediterranean Sea stretched like a vast blue tapestry woven with the dreams of countless peoples. This was not yet Mare Nostrum, our sea, as the Romans would later call it, but a gentle frontier where Phoenician purple-dyed sails caught morning breezes alongside Greek olive oil traders, where Egyptian grain ships passed Etruscan vessels laden with iron from distant mountains. The air itself seemed different then, cleaner somehow, carrying the mingled scents of cinnamon from Arabia, cedar from Lebanon, and wild thyme from Sicily's sun-warmed hills. In harbours from Spain to Syria, the sounds of morning created a symphony of human enterprise, the gentle splash of oars cutting through harbour waters, the rhythmic hammering of shipwrights mending hulls, the musical cadence of merchants speaking a dozen different tongues as they examined each other's wares with the patience of people who understood that trust, once built, could span generations. This was a world of islands, not just the physical islands scattered across the wine-dark sea, but islands of culture, each city-state a unique experiment in human organization. In Athens, philosophers gathered in marble porticos to debate the nature of justice, while potters shaped clay vessels that would carry olive oil to tables in distant lands. In Tyre, master dyers extracted precious purple from murex shells, their hands permanently stained with the colour that would become synonymous with power and wealth. In Massalia, what we now call Marseille, Greek colonists planted vines in foreign soil and learned that home could be created wherever human courage and ingenuity took root. The beauty of this early Mediterranean world lay not in uniformity, but in its magnificent diversity. Each morning brought new possibilities as traders loaded their vessels with goods unknown to their grandfathers, silk that whispered secrets of distant Chinese emperors, spices that could transform the simplest meal into a feast worthy of gods, silver coins bearing the faces of kings whose names would outlive their kingdoms. Yet beneath this peaceful complexity, currents of change were already stirring. In the Italian peninsula, a collection of hill tribes had learned the dangerous art of cooperation, creating something they called a republic, ruled by the people, or at least by some of the people. Their city, Rome, sat beside the muddy Tiber River like a patient spider, spinning webs of alliance and obligation that grew stronger with each passing season. Far to the south, along the North African coast, another power was emerging from the ancient Phoenician tradition of seafaring and trade. Carthage, New City in the old tongue, had grown from a trading post into something unprecedented, a maritime empire that existed not as conquered territory, but as a network of willing partners, bound together by mutual profit, and the knowledge that the sea connected rather than divided those brave enough to trust their lives to wind and wave. The morning light that painted both Roman hills and Carthaginian harbours the same shade of gold could not reveal the future brewing in human hearts. How could anyone foresee that these two experiments in civilization, one built on the solid foundations of land and law, the other floating on the endless possibilities of maritime trade, would soon discover that the Mediterranean, for all its vastness, was not large enough for both their dreams? In marketplaces from Alexandria to Gades, the goods that passed from hand to hand told stories of a world growing smaller with each successful voyage, each profitable season. The bronze mirrors crafted in Etruscan workshops reflected African faces. The ivory combs carved in Carthaginian ateliers arranged hair that had never seen the African sun. Cultural boundaries blurred like watercolours in the rain, as ideas travelled the same routes as merchandise, creating a civilization richer and more complex than any the world had yet seen. The peaceful rhythm of this interconnected world created its own gentle music. The sound of coins counted in counting houses, the splash of wine poured in harbours where yesterday's enemies shared tomorrow's profits, the laughter of children who spoke their fathers' languages but dreamed in the universal tongue of possibility. It was a world where distance meant safety, where the horizon promised adventure rather than conquest, where the greatest warriors were often those who chose negotiation over battle and patience over pride. But even in paradise, the seeds of change take root in soil enriched by success. The very prosperity that made this Mediterranean morning so golden would soon tempt those who measured wealth not in shared abundance, but in exclusive control. The same skills that created networks of peaceful trade could be turned to purposes far less gentle, and the ships that carried silk and spices could just as easily carry soldiers and siege engines. As the sun climbed higher in that ancient sky, painting the sea in shades of blue that poets would spend lifetimes trying to capture in words, the Mediterranean world basked in the last golden moments of its childhood innocence, unaware that somewhere in the distant future historians would mark this era as the calm before the storm that would reshape human civilization forever. Along the banks of the Tiber River, where morning mist rose like the breath of sleeping gods, a remarkable experiment in human organization was taking shape so quietly that even its participants might not have recognized its ultimate significance. Rome in its earliest days was not the marble metropolis that would one day span 3 continents, but rather a collection of modest settlements scattered across 7 hills, bound together by something more revolutionary than conquest, the radical idea that strangers could become family. The earliest Romans woke each morning to a world defined by the rhythm of seasons and the honest labour of their hands. The sound that greeted each dawn was not the clash of weapons, but the gentle lowing of cattle as they were led to pasture, the soft conversation of women drawing water from wells, the steady chopping of axes as men cleared forests that would become the fields to feed their children's children. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from cooking fires, the earthy smell of freshly turned soil, and the clean fragrance of rain on stone, simple pleasures that would ground Roman character for centuries to come. What made Rome different from its neighbours was not superior strength or strategic position, but something far more subtle, an instinctive understanding that survival required not just physical courage, but moral imagination. When conflicts arose with neighbouring tribes, Rome's early leaders discovered something that would become the secret of their eventual greatness. They could make former enemies into citizens, transforming potential threats into sources of strength through the simple but radical process of inclusion. Picture a Roman farmer returning home at sunset after a day spent working land that his grandfather had defended with sword and spear. Now that same land was tended by families whose ancestors had once raided Roman grain stores, but who had been welcomed into the Roman community through rituals that transformed outsiders into insiders, strangers into neighbors. The children of former enemies played together in Roman streets, learned Roman laws, and grew up thinking of themselves not as conquered peoples but as Romans by choice and adoption. This transformation was not forced but invited, not rapid but patient, like the slow growth of an oak tree whose roots grow deeper with each passing year. Roman citizenship was not a birthright alone but an achievement, something that could be earned through loyalty, service, and the gradual adoption of Roman values: duty before pleasure, community before individual interest, law before arbitrary power. These values were not imposed from above, but grew organically from the practical experience of people learning to live together despite their different origins. The physical environment of early Rome reinforced these moral lessons. The city's position among hills provided natural defences, but it also required cooperation. Water had to be brought up from the river, grain had to be carried across valleys, communication between settlements required paths that could only be maintained through collective effort. The landscape itself taught Romans that individual strength was less important than collective organisation, that the most difficult tasks became manageable when shared among many hands and many minds. In the Forum, not yet the marble showcase it would become, but simply the open area where roads converged, Romans gathered each evening to discuss the affairs of their community. These were not formal political debates, but organic conversations where merchants shared news from distant markets, farmers compared notes about weather and crops, and veterans told stories that preserved both tactical knowledge and moral instruction. Children listened from the edges of these circles, absorbing lessons about leadership, loyalty, and the delicate balance between authority and freedom that would shape their own decisions when their turn came to guide the community. Roman religious practices reflected the same spirit of practical cooperation with divine forces. Their gods were not distant cosmic powers, but active participants in daily life, deities who governed specific aspects of human activity and could be approached through proper rituals and genuine respect. The Roman calendar was filled with festivals that brought the community together in celebration of shared harvests, successful endeavours, and the passage of seasons that marked the steady progress of collective life. The homes where Romans slept and dreamed were simple but solid, built not for display but for endurance. Walls of local stone supported roofs of clay tiles that would last for generations, creating spaces where families could gather around hearths that burned with wood cut from Roman forests. These were places designed for conversation rather than isolation, where grandparents told stories that preserved the community's memory, where parents taught children skills that would serve both individual ambition and collective good. The food that sustained Roman bodies was simple but nourishing: bread baked from grain grown in Roman fields, wine pressed from grapes that had been tended with Roman hands, vegetables cultivated in gardens that reflected the patient care characteristic of Roman character. Meals were times for sharing not just nourishment but news, ideas, and the gentle corrections that helped young Romans understand their place in the larger community. The Roman approach to education emphasized practical wisdom over abstract knowledge. Children learned to read and write, but they also learned to judge character, to assess situations accurately, and to make decisions that balanced personal interest with community welfare. The stories they memorized were not mere entertainment, but moral instruction disguised as adventure, tales of heroes who succeeded through virtue rather than force, leaders who earned loyalty through service rather than demanding it through fear. As Roman power gradually extended beyond the Seven Hills, these early patterns established precedents that would shape the character of Roman expansion for centuries to come. Each new alliance was seen not as conquest but as adoption, each former enemy as a potential source of strength. The Roman genius lay not in superior military technology or strategic brilliance, but in this fundamental insight that lasting power comes not from the ability to defeat opponents, but from the ability to transform them into partners. The quiet confidence that characterized early Roman culture emerged from this practical experience of successful inclusion. Romans learned to trust their institutions because those institutions had repeatedly proven their worth through the test of experience. They learned to value law over arbitrary power because they had seen how legal consistency created the predictability necessary for trade, agriculture, and family life. They learned to balance individual ambition with collective responsibility because their daily experience demonstrated that personal success and community welfare were ultimately inseparable. In the gentle evening hours when Roman families gathered for their simple meals, when children played games that prepared them for adult responsibilities, when merchants counted coins that represented successful cooperation with customers from distant communities, the seeds of future greatness were already taking root in soil prepared by generations of practical wisdom and moral imagination. This was Rome's true foundation, not the legendary she-wolf or the mythical founders, but the daily choices of ordinary people learning to build something larger than themselves through the patient accumulation of trust, law, and shared purpose. The marble monuments would come later, as would the distant conquests and the golden eagles carried to the ends of the known world. But the essential Roman character was already formed in these quiet hills beside the muddy Tiber, in these conversations beside simple hearths, in these dreams of children who would grow up to carry Roman values far beyond the horizons their ancestors had ever imagined. Across the Mediterranean, where Africa's golden coastline curved toward the setting sun, another vision of human possibility was taking shape in forms as different from Roman solidity as quicksilver is from granite. Carthage, Carthage, new city, in the ancient Phoenician tongue, rose from the sea like a dream made manifest, its white marble temples and soaring towers reflecting the morning light, as ships from 3 continents crowded its harbours with the treasures of a world grown suddenly smaller. To wake in ancient Carthage was to waken humanity's first truly global city. The sounds that greeted each dawn composed a symphony of interconnection, the gentle splash of oars as fishing boats returned with the night's catch, the musical cadence of a dozen languages bargaining over prices in the great marketplace, the rhythmic hammering from shipyards where craftsmen built vessels designed to carry dreams across vast waters. The air itself carried stories, cinnamon and pepper from India, cedar and frankincense from Lebanon, gold dust and ivory from the heart of Africa, all mingling with the salt tang of sea spray and the clean scent of marble heated by African sun. Where Rome grew through patient inclusion, Carthage expanded through patient connection. Carthaginian merchants were not conquerors but weavers, spinning threads of mutual advantage across distances that other peoples could barely imagine. From the tin mines of Britain to the silk routes of China, from the amber forests of the Baltic to the gold fields of Sudan, Carthaginian ships carried more than cargo. They carried the revolutionary idea that strangers separated by vast distances could become partners through the simple but profound act of fair exchange. The physical beauty of Carthage itself testified to this global vision. Its harbours were engineering marvels that could shelter hundreds of vessels while protecting them from both storms and enemies. The circular military harbour, hidden behind a curtain wall, housed a fleet capable of protecting Carthaginian commerce throughout the Mediterranean, while the rectangular merchant harbour bustled with activity as goods flowed in and out with the regularity of tides. Between these harbours rose the city proper, its streets laid out with geometric precision, its buildings designed not just for function, but for the sheer joy of human creation. In the residential quarters where Carthaginian families made their homes, luxury served not ostentation but the practical purpose of creating environments worthy of human aspiration. Gardens bloomed with flowers from distant lands, their pools reflecting African palms and Asian lotus blossoms in democratic harmony. Libraries preserved texts in languages from across the known world, their scrolls containing everything from astronomical observations made by Babylonian priests to poetry composed by Celtic bards. The very stones of Carthaginian streets had been shaped by craftsmen who understood that daily life should be surrounded by beauty, that the spaces where children played and lovers walked should inspire rather than merely shelter. Carthaginian religion reflected this cosmopolitan spirit. Their pantheon welcomed deities from every land their ships had visited, creating a spiritual marketplace as diverse and accommodating as their material one. Tanit, their great goddess, embodied the feminine principle that nurtures growth and protects the vulnerable, while Baal-Hamon represented the masculine force that drives exploration and discovery. In Carthaginian temples, Egyptian priests might offer incense to Isis, while Greek philosophers debated the nature of divine justice with local scholars who had studied African mysteries and Arabian wisdom. The families who called Carthage home represented humanity's growing capacity to transcend the accidents of birth. A merchant's daughter might speak Punic at home, Greek in the marketplace, Egyptian with her tutors, and Latin with the Roman traders who increasingly frequented Carthaginian ports. Her brothers might serve aboard ships that carried Carthaginian goods to lands their grandparents had known only as names in travellers' tales, returning with knowledge that expanded not just family fortunes, but human understanding of the world's magnificent diversity. Carthaginian education emphasized practical skills that served both individual advancement and collective prosperity. Children learned mathematics by calculating profits and losses in international trade, geography by tracing the routes their cities' ships followed across 3 continents, astronomy by studying the stars that guided navigators across trackless waters. But they also learned the more subtle arts of negotiation, cultural sensitivity, and the patient diplomacy required to transform potential conflicts into profitable relationships. The workshops and factories of Carthage produced goods that combined technical excellence with aesthetic appeal. Carthaginian glassware graced tables from Spain to Syria, its delicate beauty reflecting the skill of craftsmen who had learned their techniques from Egyptian masters and refined them through generations of patient experimentation. Carthaginian textiles, dyed with the famous purple extracted from murex shells, became symbols of luxury and sophistication throughout the ancient world, their production requiring knowledge of chemistry, artistry, and the complex logistics needed to gather raw materials from distant shores. The technology that made Carthaginian prosperity possible represented humanity's growing mastery over the challenges of distance and diversity. Their ships were not just transportation, but floating cities, equipped with everything needed for months-long voyages, workshops for emergency repairs, quarters for crews that might include representatives of a dozen nationalities, storage compartments designed to preserve perishable goods across vast distances. Carthaginian navigators developed techniques for celestial navigation that allowed them to find their way across open ocean, transforming the Mediterranean from a barrier into a highway. In the marketplaces where Carthaginian merchants conducted their business, the future of human interaction was being quietly invented. Here, contracts were negotiated, not in the language of conquest, but in the vocabulary of mutual advantage. Disputes were resolved not through violence, but through arbitration systems that recognized the legitimacy of different cultural approaches to justice and fairness. Credit systems allowed goods to change hands across vast distances based on nothing more substantial than reputation and trust, creating networks of obligation and opportunity that spanned continents. The political system that governed Carthage reflected this commercial sophistication. Unlike Rome, which had developed its institutions through the practical experience of managing local affairs, Carthage created governmental structures designed to coordinate activities across vast distances and diverse populations. The Carthaginian Senate included representatives from colonies and trading partners throughout the Mediterranean, while the city's judges were chosen for their knowledge of international law and their ability to balance competing interests fairly. Carthaginian military organization differed fundamentally from Roman approaches. Where Rome relied on citizen soldiers motivated by patriotic duty, Carthage employed professional armies recruited from across the known world. Libyan infantry, Numidian cavalry, Spanish swordsmen, Celtic warriors, Greek engineers, all served under Carthaginian commanders who understood that victory required not just courage, but the ability to coordinate diverse fighting styles into unified force. This military multiculturalism would later produce generals like Hannibal, whose genius lay partly in his ability to inspire loyalty among soldiers who shared no common language except their respect for his leadership. As the sun set over Carthaginian harbours, painting the city's white walls in shades of gold and purple that no artist could capture, families gathered for evening meals that might include spices from India, wines from Sicily, fish from Atlantic waters, and fruits from African oases. These were not displays of wealth but celebrations of human connection, acknowledgements that the world had grown rich through the patient work of people willing to trust strangers, to venture into unknown waters, to believe that difference could be a source of strength rather than a cause for conflict. The dreams that filled Carthaginian sleep were dreams of horizons yet unexplored, of partnerships yet unformed, of possibilities that could only be realized through the courage to venture beyond the familiar into the magnificent uncertainty of a world where every sunrise might bring news of discoveries that would change everything. In this city built on the patient optimism of merchants and mariners, the future seemed as vast and full of promise as the ocean that stretched endlessly beyond their harbours, between the Italian peninsula and the coast of Africa. Like a triangular jewel dropped by careless gods into the azure Mediterranean, Sicily lay basking in eternal sunshine, a land so blessed by nature that poets would spend lifetimes searching for words worthy of its beauty. This was Trinacria, the three-cornered island whose very position at the crossroads of civilizations made it both irresistible and dangerous. A prize so magnificent that its possession would determine which power would dominate the ancient world. To stand on Sicilian shores in those quiet centuries before the storms of war was to witness paradise made manifest. The island's wheat fields stretched like golden carpets across rolling hills, their abundance so legendary that Sicily became known as the granary of the Mediterranean, capable of feeding cities from Rome to Alexandria. The morning light that bathed these fields revealed a landscape that seemed designed by divine architects, olive groves whose silver-green leaves whispered in Mediterranean breezes, vineyards heavy with grapes that would become wines worthy of the gods' own tables, orchards where lemons and oranges grew like edible sunshine beneath protective mountains. The Greek cities that crowned Sicily's coastline represented human artistry in harmony with natural splendor. In Syracuse, Archimedes might have been born to parents who woke each morning to the sight of temples that seemed to grow from living rock, their marble columns catching the first light, while fishing boats returned to harbours that had sheltered human dreams for countless generations. The theatre at Taormina, carved into a hillside overlooking the sea, offered audiences not just dramatic entertainment, but a view of Mount Etna's eternal fires reflected in waters that stretched to horizons limited only by the curve of the earth itself. The cultural richness of Sicily reflected its position as the meeting place of civilizations. Greek philosophers debated the nature of reality in academies where African merchants shared mathematical insights learned from Egyptian priests, while Roman farmers exchanged agricultural techniques with Carthaginian traders who had brought new crops from distant continents. The island's libraries preserved texts in a dozen languages. Its workshops produced goods that combined Greek aesthetic sensibility with Phoenician technical skill. Its markets offered delicacies that reflected the culinary traditions of every Mediterranean culture. The people who called Sicily home had learned the gentle art of adaptation, absorbing influences from every civilization that had touched their shores while maintaining their own distinctive character. A Sicilian fisherman might worship Greek gods while using navigation techniques learned from Carthaginian sailors, speak Latin in the marketplace while singing lullabies to his children in the ancient tongue of his ancestors, prepare his nets with knots taught by Egyptian rope makers while reading weather signs passed down through generations of local experience. The daily rhythm of Sicilian life moved with the patient cadence of agricultural seasons and maritime tides. In coastal cities, the day began with the return of fishing boats whose crews had spent the night pursuing their silver quarry beneath star-filled skies. The catch was sorted on beaches, where children played games older than memory, while their mothers prepared nets for the following night's work. Merchants from a dozen nations examined the morning's harvest, their multilingual negotiations creating a gentle babel that testified to Sicily's role as the crossroads of 3 continents. In the inland hills, farming communities followed rhythms established by centuries of experience. Wheat was planted when autumn rains had softened the earth, tended through winters mild enough to permit year-round agricultural activity, and harvested in late spring before the full heat of summer could damage the grain. The surplus that fed distant cities was loaded onto ships and harbours where Sicilian dock workers sang songs that blended melodies from Greece, Africa, and the Italian mainland into musical expressions of their island's multicultural heritage. The strategic importance of Sicily was matched by its cultural significance as a laboratory for human cooperation. Here, different approaches to law, governance, religion, and daily life encountered each other in contexts that encouraged synthesis rather than conflict. The island's political systems borrowed elements from Athenian democracy, Roman republicanism, and Carthaginian commercial organization, creating forms of governance that balanced individual freedom with collective prosperity. The artistic achievements of Sicily reflected this cultural fusion. Sicilian poets wrote verses that combined Greek formal techniques with themes drawn from local experience, their work preserving both classical traditions and indigenous wisdom. Sculptors trained in Greek techniques carved marble quarried from Sicilian mountains, creating works that honored both Hellenic ideals and African influences. Architects designed buildings that sheltered human activity while celebrating the natural beauty of their Mediterranean setting. The prosperity that flowed from Sicily's agricultural abundance and strategic position created a society where leisure could be devoted to intellectual and artistic pursuits. The island's scholars contributed to advances in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, while its artists and craftsmen produced works that graced temples and homes throughout the ancient world. This cultural flowering occurred not despite Sicily's multicultural character, but because of it. Because the island's position required its inhabitants to master the arts of translation, adaptation, and creative synthesis. Yet even in this Mediterranean paradise, shadows were beginning to gather. The very abundance that made Sicily so attractive to its inhabitants also made it irresistible to external powers whose ambitions had grown beyond their ability to satisfy through their own resources. The wheat fields that had fed Sicilian cities in peaceful prosperity could also feed the armies of distant empires. The harbours that had welcomed merchant vessels from across the known world could just as easily shelter warships whose purposes were less benevolent. The Greek cities that had flourished in independent splendour began to feel the pressure of decisions made in Rome and Carthage by leaders whose understanding of Sicily's value was measured not in cultural achievement or human happiness, but in strategic advantage and economic control. The gentle rhythms of agricultural and maritime life continued, but underneath the surface calm, currents of change were beginning to stir, currents that would soon transform the crossroads of civilization into the battleground, where 2 great powers would test their strength against each other and determine the future course of human history. As the sun set over Sicily's golden fields and marble cities, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that seemed to promise eternal beauty, the island rested in the last quiet moments before it would become the stage for conflicts that would echo through the centuries, forever changing the world that had seemed so peacefully permanent beneath the eternal Mediterranean sky. When the clouds of war first gathered over the Mediterranean in 264 BCE, they brought with them the kind of slow, inevitable transformation that changes not just the outcome of battles, but the very character of the civilizations that waged them. The First Punic War began not with grand declarations or heroic gestures, but with a local dispute in Sicily that escalated beyond anyone's expectations, drawing Rome and Carthage into a conflict that would teach both powers lessons they had never imagined they would need to learn. For Rome, this war represented the first time in their history that victory would require mastering an element they had always regarded with suspicious respect. The Romans were children of the hills and valleys, people who understood the solid reliability of earth beneath their feet, the predictable behavior of rivers that followed familiar channels, the comforting permanence of mountains that marked boundaries and provided refuge. The sea, with its endless changes, its dependence on wind and weather, its demand for skills that took lifetimes to master, seemed almost alien to the Roman character. Yet as Roman leaders gazed across the waters that separated their peninsula from Sicily's tempting harvests, they discovered that their values of persistence, discipline, and systematic learning could be applied even to challenges as fluid as naval warfare. The decision to build a fleet was not made lightly. It represented a commitment to transform Roman civilization itself, to add maritime capability to a people whose greatest strength had always been their ability to adapt and endure. The early Roman attempts at naval combat carried all the awkward determination of a farmer learning to dance. Carthaginian captains, whose families had been navigating these waters since before Rome was founded, must have watched with mixture of amusement and concern as Roman ships wallowed through maneuvers that Punic vessels executed with the grace of seabirds riding Mediterranean swells. The Romans approached naval warfare with the same methodical intensity they brought to everything else. Study and captured Carthaginian vessels plank by plank, training their crews with the relentless repetition that had made Roman infantry invincible on land. The Corvus, the famous boarding bridge that allowed Roman ships to grapple enemy vessels, represented everything characteristic about the Roman approach to unfamiliar challenges. Unable to match Carthaginian skill in seamanship and naval tactics, Roman engineers simply eliminated the sea from sea battles, creating a mechanism that turned floating duels into the kind of close combat where Roman discipline and training provided decisive advantages. The sound of the Corvus crashing down onto enemy decks became the signature of Roman naval warfare, not elegant perhaps, but devastatingly effective. The human cost of Rome's maritime education was measured not just in battle casualties, but in the broader tragedy of men learning to fight in an element that showed no mercy to inexperience. Roman fleets, heavy with the bronze rams and boarding equipment that made them formidable in combat, proved dangerously vulnerable to the Mediterranean's sudden storms. Ships that could defeat enemy squadrons in battle were crushed like toys when caught in weather that experienced Carthaginian navigators had learned to read and avoid. The disaster at Camarina, where an entire Roman fleet was destroyed by a storm that Roman commanders had either failed to anticipate or chosen to ignore, illustrated the broader challenge Rome faced in adapting to maritime warfare. On land, Roman persistence could overcome almost any obstacle. Armies that suffered defeat could regroup, learn from experience, and return stronger than before. At sea, mistakes were often final, and the Mediterranean showed no respect for courage unsupported by knowledge. Yet it was precisely this unforgiving character of naval warfare that brought out the most admirable qualities of Roman civilization. The Roman response to maritime disasters was not retreat, but renewed commitment. When storms destroyed their fleets, they built new ones. When Carthaginian tactical superiority inflicted defeats, Roman commanders studied those defeats until they understood how to counter enemy advantages. The Roman Senate voted resources for naval construction with the same steady determination that their ancestors had shown in clearing forests and draining swamps, viewing each setback as education rather than failure. The transformation of Roman character during this first war extended far beyond military matters. Soldiers who had never seen salt water returned to their hill towns with stories of horizons that stretched beyond imagination, of islands where different peoples spoke strange languages, of storms that dwarfed any weather phenomena they had experienced on land. These veterans brought back not just tactical knowledge, but expanded awareness of the world's size and complexity, planting seeds of cosmopolitan thinking in Roman culture. Carthaginian responses to Roman naval development revealed the strengths and limitations of their own approach to warfare. Carthaginian commanders possessed generations of accumulated maritime wisdom, understanding of wind patterns and seasonal changes that allowed them to operate in conditions that would destroy Roman fleets. Their ships were faster, more maneuverable, crewed by sailors whose families had followed the sea for centuries. Yet this very expertise created a kind of strategic complacency, an assumption that superior skill would always triumph over superior numbers and determination. The economic dimensions of this first war highlighted the different resource bases that each civilization could draw upon. Rome's strength lay in its ability to mobilize the manpower and material resources of the Italian peninsula, transforming farmers into soldiers and craftsmen into shipbuilders with systematic efficiency. Carthage relied more heavily on professional troops and hired specialists, an approach that provided tactical flexibility but proved vulnerable to the kind of prolonged conflict that Rome was prepared to sustain almost indefinitely. The siege of Lilybaeum demonstrated how Roman persistence could eventually overcome Carthaginian tactical superiority. For nearly a decade, Roman forces maintained their grip on this crucial Sicilian stronghold, while Carthaginian fleets attempted to break the blockade through superior seamanship and local knowledge. The Romans absorbed losses that would have broken other powers, learning from each engagement, adapting their techniques, gradually developing the naval expertise that would allow them to meet Carthaginian ships on equal terms. The Battle of the Agates Islands, which finally ended the war in Rome's favour, represented the culmination of a quarter-century of Roman maritime education. The Roman fleet that defeated the Carthaginian relief force was no longer the clumsy collection of converted merchant vessels that had first challenged Punic naval supremacy. These were purpose-built warships, crewed by experienced sailors who had learned to read weather and wind, to coordinate complex maneuvers, to fight as effectively on water as their fathers had fought on land. The terms of peace that ended the First Punic War reflected not just military victory, but the transformation that victory had wrought in Roman capabilities and ambitions. Rome's acquisition of Sicily represented more than territorial expansion. It marked the beginning of Rome's evolution from a regional power into something unprecedented in Mediterranean history, a state capable of projecting force across water barriers that had previously limited the scope of ancient conflicts. For Carthage, defeat brought not just the loss of Sicily, but the painful recognition that their maritime monopoly could be challenged by powers willing to invest the resources and endure the losses necessary to master naval warfare. The war demonstrated that Carthaginian advantages in skill and experience could be overcome by Roman advantages in persistence and systematic preparation, a lesson that would influence Carthaginian strategic thinking for the remainder of their civilization's existence. The broader impact of this first war extended throughout the Mediterranean world as smaller powers observed the implications of Rome's naval development. The sea, which had previously served as a protective barrier for island and coastal communities, could no longer guarantee safety from Roman ambitions. The balance of power that had characterized the ancient Mediterranean for centuries was shifting in ways that would reshape the political geography of 3 continents. As the 23-year conflict drew to its close, both Rome and Carthage had been transformed by their struggle. Rome had gained not just Sicily, but confidence in its ability to adapt to unfamiliar challenges, while Carthage had learned that commercial and naval excellence alone might not be sufficient to maintain its position against opponents willing to match any sacrifice in pursuit of victory. The stage was set for future conflicts that would test not just military capability, but the deepest foundations of each civilization's approach to power, politics, and the complex art of survival in a world where the stakes were growing ever higher. In the 23 years that separated the First Punic War from the Second, the Mediterranean world resembled a theatre during intermission, the stage apparently empty but humming with preparation for performances that would surpass anything the audience had yet witnessed. This was not the peace of satisfaction, but the peace of exhaustion, slowly giving way to renewed ambition, as both Rome and Carthage absorbed the lessons of their first great conflict and prepared for what both suspected would be an inevitable second trial of strength. The silence that settled over the disputed waters between Sicily and Africa carried within it the sound of hammers on anvils, the scrape of bronze against whetstones, the patient voices of veterans teaching younger men skills that might soon mean the difference between victory and death. Both civilizations had discovered that their first war had been not a conclusion, but an education, revealing capabilities they had not known they possessed and weaknesses they had not imagined they harbored. In Rome, the transformation wrought by naval victory manifested itself in ways both obvious and subtle. The city's harbour bristled with new construction as Roman shipwrights applied lessons learned through costly experience, building vessels that combined Italian engineering with adaptations borrowed from captured Carthaginian designs. But the more profound changes were occurring in Roman thinking itself, as a people accustomed to viewing their world from the solid perspective of land began to appreciate the strategic possibilities that control of the sea might offer. Roman roads, already renowned for their engineering excellence, began extending toward coastal cities with new urgency. These were not merely commercial arteries, but the circulatory system of an empire learning to coordinate land and sea operations. Veterans who had learned to fight on ships returned to their hill towns carrying maps of islands they had captured, stories of peoples they had encountered, and expanded notions of what Roman citizenship might encompass if Roman power continued to grow. The integration of Sicily into the Roman system provided a laboratory for testing administrative techniques that would later govern provinces spanning 3 continents. Roman officials learning to manage agricultural production in Sicily's grain fields, Roman judges adapting Roman law to circumstances their legal traditions had never anticipated, Roman merchants establishing trading relationships that connected Italian workshops with Sicilian harvests, all were participating in the quiet creation of systems that would prove capable of governing the known world. Across the sea, Carthage was conducting its own experiments in adaptation and expansion. The loss of Sicily had deprived the Punic state not just of territory, but of agricultural revenues that had funded much of Carthaginian naval supremacy. The response was characteristically Carthaginian in its scope and sophistication, a systematic expansion into Spain that would replace lost Sicilian grain with Spanish silver, lost Sicilian harbours with new bases along the Iberian coast. Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian commander who had negotiated the peace that ended the First Punic War, carried his family's ambitions and his civilization's hopes into the Spanish wilderness with the patient determination of a merchant establishing a new trade route. But this expansion was different from traditional Carthaginian commercial ventures. It combined trade with territorial control, diplomacy with military conquest, in ways that suggested Carthage was learning from Roman methods even as it prepared to challenge Roman power. The Spain that Hamilcar and his successors carved into a new Carthaginian empire was rich beyond the dreams of traditional Mediterranean powers. Silver mines, worked by techniques imported from across the ancient world, produced wealth that flowed back to Carthage in quantities that restored Punic confidence and funded military preparations on a scale that the First Punic War had never required. Spanish warriors, trained in Carthaginian discipline but retaining their native ferocity, created armies that combined the best qualities of professional and tribal military traditions. The marriage of Hamilcar's daughter to Hasdrubal the Fair represented more than diplomatic alliance. It symbolized Carthage's commitment to creating in Spain something unprecedented in Punic history, a territorial empire that could match Roman expansion with Carthaginian alternatives. The city of Carthago Nova, built by Hasdrubal on Spain's Mediterranean coast, rose like a new Carthage designed to support ambitions that the original Carthage had never needed to entertain. Yet even as both powers prepared for future conflicts, the daily life of the Mediterranean continued to follow patterns established by centuries of peaceful interaction. Merchants from a dozen nations still gathered in harbours from Gades to Alexandria. Their conversations still focused more on profit margins than military preparations. Farmers still planted and harvested according to seasonal rhythms that had governed agricultural life since before either Rome or Carthage had been founded. Philosophers still debated questions of justice and virtue in academies where the political tensions of their age seemed less important than the eternal human search for wisdom and understanding. This surface calm could not entirely conceal the currents of change flowing beneath. Veterans of the First Punic War gathered in taverns throughout the Mediterranean, their stories of storm and battle inspiring younger men to imagine themselves tested in similar crucibles. The weapons they had carried were being studied by smiths, who sought to improve upon designs that had proven themselves in combat. The maps they had used were being copied and updated by geographers whose work would guide future expeditions into regions that peace had made temporarily inaccessible. The most significant development of this interwar period was perhaps the least visible: the emergence of a generation that had grown to maturity, knowing that the Mediterranean was no longer large enough to contain the ambitions of its greatest powers. Young Romans who had heard their fathers' stories of Sicily began to dream of conquests that might extend Roman influence to the Atlantic Ocean or the borders of Egypt. Young Carthaginians, raised on tales of Hamilcar's Spanish adventures, imagined campaigns that might humble Rome permanently and restore Punic supremacy throughout the ancient world. It was during this period that Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, first began to attract the attention of those who understood that individual genius, when combined with historical opportunity, could reshape the destiny of nations. His education in Spanish camps where Carthaginian strategy was tested against tribal warfare, his exposure to the international environment of Carthaginian expansion, his early demonstration of the kind of tactical brilliance that could inspire loyalty among soldiers who shared no common language except their respect for superior leadership. All these factors were combining to create a man capable of attempting what conventional wisdom would declare impossible. The peace that had seemed so welcome after the exhaustion of the First Punic War was gradually revealing itself as merely preparation for conflicts that would test not just military capability, but the fundamental assumptions about power, politics, and cultural survival that underpinned Mediterranean civilization. As this interwar period drew toward its close, thoughtful observers in both Rome and Carthage might have recognized that they were living through the last quiet moments before storms that would reshape the ancient world in ways that neither victory nor defeat in their first war had prepared them to imagine. In the mountain camps of Spain, where Carthaginian discipline merged with Iberian ferocity beneath skies that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of imagination, a young man was learning to see the world as a collection of problems waiting for solutions that conventional wisdom had declared impossible. Hannibal Barca, heir to his father's ambitions and his civilization's hopes, was absorbing lessons that would transform him from a promising military commander into something unprecedented in ancient warfare, a strategic genius capable of conceiving victories that existed only in the realm of dreams until his will made them reality. The education of Hannibal began not with formal instruction, but with the patient observation of how different peoples approached the fundamental challenges of survival, organization, and conflict. In Hamilcar's Spanish camps, Celtic warriors who fought with the fury of wild animals learned to coordinate their attacks according to Carthaginian tactical principles, while African cavalry, whose families had ridden across deserts for generations, adapted their mobile warfare to Spanish terrain and Roman defensive methods. Hannibal watched these cultural fusions with the intensity of a scholar studying texts, absorbing not just military techniques, but deeper lessons about human flexibility and the power of imagination to transcend apparent limitations. The languages that Hannibal mastered, Punic, Latin, Greek, Celtic dialects, and the various tongues of Spanish tribes, were not merely communication tools, but windows into different ways of understanding reality itself. Each language carried within it assumptions about leadership, loyalty, courage, and the proper relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare. By thinking in multiple languages, Hannibal developed the cognitive flexibility that would later allow him to devise strategies that seemed impossible to minds constrained by single cultural perspectives. The maps that covered the walls of Hannibal's quarters told stories of a world far larger and more complex than most ancients could imagine. These were not mere geographical representations, but strategic puzzles showing how mountains could become highways for those patient enough to find the hidden passes, how rivers could become bridges for armies equipped with proper engineering support, how distances that seemed prohibitive could be conquered by leaders willing to transform impossible journeys into systematic campaigns of endurance and adaptation. The oath that 9-year-old Hannibal swore at his father's altar to never be friend to Rome has often been interpreted as childish hatred. But the mature Hannibal who emerged from Spanish training camps had transformed personal vendetta into something far more sophisticated, a comprehensive understanding of Roman strengths and weaknesses that would guide strategic thinking, capable of challenging the fundamental assumptions upon which Roman power rested. This was not the blind anger of revenge, but the patient calculation of a mind that had learned to see conflict as an elaborate puzzle requiring creative solutions. The army that Hannibal assembled for his Italian campaign represented a military innovation as revolutionary as any tactical formation, a truly international force held together not by shared ethnicity or common language, but by collective respect for leadership that had proven itself capable of achieving victories that other commanders could not even conceive. Spanish infantry whose ancestors had never seen the Mediterranean marched alongside African cavalry whose families had followed the desert trade routes for generations, while Celtic warriors from the Pyrenees served under officers who spoke languages they had never heard, but whose competence they had learned to trust through shared experiences of impossible success. The elephants that accompanied Hannibal's army served functions far beyond their practical military applications. These magnificent creatures, trained to function in climates and terrains far from their African origins, embodied Hannibal's fundamental strategic philosophy, that apparent impossibilities often concealed practical solutions for minds flexible enough to perceive them. The sight of war elephants crossing Spanish rivers, or climbing mountain paths that had never known such traffic, served as daily reminders to every soldier in Hannibal's army that their commander possessed the kind of imagination that could transform natural obstacles into temporary inconveniences. The logistics that supported Hannibal's Spanish campaigns provided essential training for the even more ambitious operations he was beginning to contemplate. Moving large armies across difficult terrain required not just tactical brilliance, but systematic attention to details that conventional military thinking often overlooked. The mathematics of supply consumption, the psychology of maintaining morale during long marches, the engineering challenges of river crossings and siege warfare. Hannibal's study of Roman military methods revealed both the sources of Roman success and the potential vulnerabilities that superior strategy might exploit. Roman strength lay in systematic discipline, standardized training, and the kind of institutional memory that allowed Roman armies to apply lessons learned in previous campaigns to new challenges. But these very strengths created predictable patterns that a sufficiently creative opponent might turn to his own advantage. Roman tactical formations, designed for maximum effectiveness in conventional battles, might prove vulnerable to attacks that followed unconventional approaches. Roman strategic assumptions, based on successful experience in previous conflicts, might not anticipate challenges that originated from unexpected directions. The Spanish silver that funded Carthaginian military preparations during Hannibal's youth represented more than mineral wealth. It embodied Carthage's growing understanding that the struggle with Rome required resources on a scale that commercial prosperity alone could not provide. The mining techniques imported from across the ancient world, the smelting methods that maximized extraction from Spanish ore, the transportation systems that carried precious metals from mountain mines to coastal ports, all were components of a comprehensive effort to create the material foundation for military campaigns that would test every aspect of Carthaginian civilization. The city of Saguntum, which would provide the immediate pretext for the Second Punic War, represented in microcosm the broader strategic challenges that Hannibal had spent his youth learning to solve. This Spanish city's alliance with Rome created a Roman foothold in what Carthage considered its sphere of influence, but more importantly, it embodied the kind of political complexity that required solutions combining military pressure with diplomatic sophistication. Hannibal's siege of Saguntum demonstrated not just tactical competence, but strategic vision. The understanding that local conflicts could be transformed into pretexts for much larger campaigns if properly managed by leaders capable of seeing immediate challenges in their broader historical context. The message that Hannibal sent to Carthage requesting permission to attack Saguntum revealed the mature strategic thinking that had emerged from his Spanish education. This was not a request for permission to begin a local war, but a proposal to initiate a comprehensive challenge to Roman power throughout the Mediterranean. The conquest of Saguntum would inevitably provoke Roman response, but Hannibal had already begun planning operations that would carry that response far beyond anything Roman strategic thinking had prepared for. The dreams that filled Hannibal's sleep during his final months in Spain were dreams of a campaign that would transform the entire Mediterranean world. Roman armies defeated in their own territory by strategies they had never encountered. Italian cities liberated from Roman control by a leader who understood that lasting victory required not just military success, but political imagination. A Carthaginian empire restored to preeminence through methods that combined traditional Punic sophistication with innovations born from the unique conditions of Spanish warfare. The psychological preparation that Hannibal underwent during these final months of peace represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of his education. The kind of campaign he was contemplating would require not just tactical brilliance, but the inner strength to maintain purpose and vision through challenges that would test every aspect of human endurance. The crossing of the Alps that he was already planning would demand the kind of leadership that could inspire men to follow their commander beyond the boundaries of the possible, into realms where only absolute faith in superior vision could sustain the will to continue. As Hannibal stood on Spanish mountainsides gazing toward the distant peaks that separated him from Italy, he was seeing not geographical obstacles, but the components of a strategic masterpiece that would demonstrate to the ancient world that human imagination, when combined with sufficient will and adequate preparation, could accomplish feats that conventional wisdom declared impossible. The man who would soon lead elephants across the Alps was already living in a mental landscape where the transformation of dreams into reality had become not just possible, but inevitable, requiring only the patience and precision necessary to translate vision into systematic action. The education that had created Hannibal was complete, but the examination that would test everything he had learned was about to begin. When autumn mists began to gather around the peaks that separated Spain from Italy, they seemed to whisper warnings that no sane commander would ignore. These mountains had never witnessed the passage of organized armies, much less the impossible spectacle of African war elephants crossing terrain that challenged even experienced mountain dwellers. Yet as Hannibal gazed toward those forbidding heights, he saw not obstacles but opportunities, a route so unexpected that Roman strategic planning had never seriously considered the possibility of attack from the north. The preparation for this impossible journey had consumed months of patient planning that revealed Hannibal's genius extended far beyond battlefield tactics into the realm of logistical innovation. Scouts had spent the previous winter establishing relationships with mountain tribes, negotiating passage rights, caching supplies at strategic points along routes that existed more in Carthaginian imagination than in geographical reality. Engineers had studied the challenges of moving siege equipment and supply wagons across terrain that had never known wheels, developing techniques for bridge construction and path improvement that would transform impassable mountains into a highway for determined armies. The army that began its ascent into the Alps represented humanity at its most audacious, 90,000 men who had abandoned everything familiar to follow a leader whose promises seemed to defy natural law itself. Spanish infantry who had never seen snow marched beside African cavalry whose desert-bred horses snorted nervously at the thinning air. Celtic warriors from Gaul, recruited during the army's passage through what would one day be France, brought with them knowledge of mountain warfare that would prove invaluable in the trials ahead. Veterans of Spanish campaigns shared their rations with recruits who had joined the expedition more from curiosity than conviction, all bound together by trust in a commander who had never asked them to attempt anything he would not dare himself. The elephants that accompanied this extraordinary procession had become symbols of Hannibal's entire approach to warfare, the belief that apparent impossibilities could be overcome through patient preparation and absolute determination. These magnificent creatures, trained since birth to serve in military operations, now faced challenges that no elephant trainer had ever contemplated. African animals bred for warm climates would need to survive in conditions where Mediterranean blood froze in unprotected veins. Beasts accustomed to relatively level terrain would need to navigate paths barely wide enough for human passage, where a single misstep meant death, not just for the animal, but for the soldiers whose supplies the elephants carried. The first weeks of the ascent tested every aspect of Hannibal's leadership, as the army encountered challenges that no amount of planning could have entirely anticipated. Mountain tribes that had agreed to permit passage demanded tribute that exceeded their original agreements, forcing Hannibal to choose between potentially crippling losses and battles that would deplete his forces before the real campaign had even begun. Weather patterns that Spanish scouts had predicted proved more severe than anticipated, coating rock paths with ice that made every step treacherous for both men and animals. The sound that echoed through those ancient valleys told the story of human determination confronting natural forces that seemed designed to humble mortal ambition. The scrape of metal-shod sandals against stone, the laboured breathing of men and animals unaccustomed to such altitude. the crack of ice under the weight of war elephants whose presence in such terrain seemed to violate the natural order itself. At night, when the army made camp in valleys where Mediterranean stars seemed close enough to touch, soldiers shared warmth around fires fed with wood that had to be carried from lower elevations, their conversations blending languages that had never before been spoken in these remote places. The engineering challenges of the crossing required innovations that would have seemed impossible to military commanders trained in conventional warfare. Paths that had accommodated individual travelers or small groups of mountain dwellers needed to be widened to allow passage of siege equipment and supply trains. Rivers that could be forded during favorable seasons had become torrents swollen by autumn rains, requiring bridge construction using materials that had to be improvised from local resources. Rock falls that blocked traditional routes forced engineers to create new paths by techniques that combined Roman systematic methods with adaptations borrowed from Celtic mountain warfare. The most dangerous moments of the crossing came not during spectacular crises, but during the daily accumulation of challenges that tested the army's collective will to continue. Each morning brought new evidence that the journey was taking longer than anticipated, consuming supplies at rates that made every meal a calculation of survival mathematics. Each evening brought casualty reports that included not just battle losses, but the steady attrition of men and animals who had reached their limits of endurance. Each night brought temperatures that made sleep difficult and morning preparations agonizing for soldiers whose equipment had not been designed for such conditions. The psychological dimension of the crossing proved as challenging as its physical demands. Soldiers who had volunteered for what they understood would be a difficult campaign discovered that they were participating in something unprecedented in human experience, an attempt to accomplish what conventional wisdom declared impossible. The mood of the army fluctuated between exhilaration at their unique achievement and despair at the mounting evidence that their losses might make victory impossible even if they succeeded in reaching Italy. Hannibal's ability to maintain morale during the supreme test of leadership required not just tactical competence, but the kind of inspirational presence that could sustain hope when rational calculations suggested despair. The most famous incident of the crossing, the avalanche that blocked the army's passage and required engineers to heat rocks with fires and split them with vinegar, has become legendary not just as a demonstration of ancient engineering, but as a metaphor for Hannibal's entire approach to seemingly insurmountable obstacles. When conventional methods proved inadequate, Carthaginian ingenuity discovered alternatives that transformed natural barriers into temporary inconveniences. The technique itself may have been borrowed from mountain peoples who had used similar methods for generations, but its application to military logistics demonstrated the kind of creative thinking that would characterize Hannibal's entire Italian campaign. The descent from the Alps proved in some ways more treacherous than the ascent, as soldiers and animals struggled to maintain footing on paths made slippery by snow and ice. The army that had begun the crossing in disciplined formations often found itself strung out in single file along paths where mutual assistance was impossible, and individual survival depended on personal determination to complete a journey that had already claimed thousands of lives. The sight of Italy stretching below them like a promised land provided psychological relief that sustained the final stages of a march that had tested human endurance beyond anything previous military history had recorded. The army that descended into the Po Valley bore little resemblance to the force that had begun the crossing weeks earlier. Nearly half of Hannibal's original 90,000 men had been lost to weather, warfare, and the simple attrition of an impossible journey. Most of the elephants had perished, victims of cold and terrain that no amount of training could have prepared them to survive. Equipment had been abandoned or improvised, supplies were nearly exhausted, and many survivors showed signs of frostbite and altitude sickness that would affect their effectiveness in future battles. Yet what remained was something unprecedented in ancient warfare, an army that had accomplished the impossible and knew it. These soldiers had followed their commander beyond the boundaries of the known world into realms where only absolute faith in superior leadership had sustained the will to continue. They had seen natural obstacles transformed into stepping stones through the application of human intelligence and determination. They had participated in an achievement that would be remembered as long as human beings valued courage, imagination, and the refusal to accept conventional limitations as permanent boundaries to human possibility. The transformation wrought by the Alpine crossing extended beyond military capability into the realm of psychological warfare. Rome, which had prepared for a conventional conflict fought on familiar terms in predictable theatres, now faced an enemy who had demonstrated that Roman assumptions about natural boundaries and strategic impossibilities were merely failures of imagination. The army that had crossed the Alps carried with it not just weapons and supplies, but the kind of confidence that comes from having attempted the impossible and succeeded. The news arrived in Rome like thunder from a clear sky. Hannibal had crossed the Alps and was marching through the Po Valley, gathering Celtic allies and defeating Roman forces with tactics that seemed to transform familiar landscapes into alien battlefields. For a people accustomed to fighting their wars in distant territories, the prospect of enemy armies operating in Italy itself created a psychological shock that reverberated through every level of Roman society, from the marble halls of the Senate to the humblest farming villages scattered across the peninsula. The Battle of the Trebia, fought in the bitter cold of a North Italian winter, introduced Romans to a new kind of warfare that challenged every assumption their military traditions had established about proper conduct of organized violence. Hannibal's use of hidden forces, coordinated cavalry attacks, and terrain exploitation demonstrated tactical sophistication that Roman commanders had never encountered and Roman soldiers had never trained to counter. The sound of Celtic war horns echoing across frozen fields, the sight of Numidian cavalry appearing where Roman intelligence had detected no enemy presence, the feel of tactical formations dissolving under pressures they had been designed to resist. All these experiences forced Romans to confront the possibility that their military superiority might be less absolute than they had assumed. Lake Trasimene revealed the full extent of Hannibal's genius for psychological warfare, disguised as tactical innovation. The ambush that destroyed an entire Roman army demonstrated not just superior planning, but deeper understanding of how Roman confidence could be transformed into Roman vulnerability. The morning mist that concealed Carthaginian preparations became a metaphor for the fog of confusion that would shroud Roman strategic thinking throughout Hannibal's Italian campaigns. Romans who had awakened expecting another routine march found themselves trapped in a killing ground designed by an enemy who understood their movements better than they understood his intentions. The aftermath of Trasimene spread panic through Roman territory as news travelled faster than military messengers. Farming communities that had existed in peaceful prosperity since their incorporation into the Roman system suddenly faced the prospect of hostile armies operating in their familiar landscapes. The smoke that rose from burning villas marked not just property destruction, but the collapse of assumptions about security that had governed Roman rural life for generations. Women gathered their children and precious possessions while scanning horizons that had always promised safety, but now might conceal approaching danger. The strategic brilliance of Hannibal's Italian campaign lay not in his ability to win individual battles, but in his understanding of how military success could be leveraged to achieve political objectives that pure force could never accomplish. Each victory demonstrated to Rome's Italian allies that Roman power was not invincible, that alternatives to Roman domination might exist for those brave enough to embrace them. The psychological pressure created by Hannibal's presence in Italy forced Romans to defend their homeland while simultaneously trying to maintain control over territories and peoples whose loyalty had never been tested by such extreme circumstances. Cannae, the name would become synonymous with military catastrophe throughout subsequent history, represented the culmination of everything Hannibal had learned about Roman strengths and how they could be transformed into fatal weaknesses. The double envelopment that destroyed the largest army Rome had ever fielded was not just tactical genius, but strategic artistry, demonstrating how superior understanding of enemy psychology could create opportunities that existed only in the minds of commanders capable of seeing beyond conventional limitations. The dust that settled over the Cannae battlefield covered more than Roman dead. It marked the end of Roman assumptions about their own invincibility, and the beginning of a period when survival itself would require resources of character that peacetime prosperity had never demanded. The casualty figures. 8 Roman legions destroyed, 50,000 men killed or captured, represented losses that would have ended the war for any conventional ancient power. Roman mothers who had expected their sons to return victorious instead received news that challenged the fundamental premises upon which they had built their understanding of the world. Yet even as Hannibal's tactical masterpiece created military catastrophe for Rome, it also revealed the strategic limitations that would ultimately doom his entire campaign. The very completeness of his victory at Cannae demonstrated both his capabilities and their bounds. He could destroy Roman armies with unprecedented efficiency, but he could not destroy the Roman system that produced those armies. He could inflict defeats that would have shattered other civilizations, but he could not penetrate the deeper sources of Roman strength that lay not in military formations but in political institutions and cultural values. The Roman response to Cannae illustrated the unique characteristics that would eventually enable Roman victory, despite overwhelming tactical disadvantages. Instead of seeking peace terms that any rational calculation would have recommended, the Roman Senate voted to continue the war regardless of cost. Instead of panic, Roman leadership demonstrated the kind of systematic determination that transformed catastrophic defeats into educational experiences. Instead of despair, Roman society mobilized resources that revealed reserves of strength that prosperity had kept hidden. The countryside through which Hannibal marched after Cannae bore witness to the complex dynamics of a war that had transcended simple military confrontation to become a test of civilizational endurance. Italian communities that had been incorporated into the Roman system faced impossible choices between loyalty to distant Rome and accommodation with the victorious Carthaginian army that controlled their immediate environment. The decisions they made revealed the true effectiveness of Roman integration policies. Most Italian allies remained faithful to Rome, even when Roman power seemed shattered beyond recovery. The famous march on Rome that Hannibal chose not to undertake after Cannae became the subject of endless speculation among ancient historians, and remains controversial among modern scholars. Some interpreted his hesitation as evidence of strategic timidity at the crucial moment, while others recognized it as acknowledgement of deeper truths about the nature of Roman power. Rome's strength lay not in its walls or fortifications, but in its capacity to absorb defeats and continue functioning. A resilience that could not be destroyed through single battles regardless of their tactical brilliance. The winter quarters that Hannibal established in southern Italy provided temporary respite from campaigning, but also revealed the fundamental challenges that would eventually doom his expedition. Cut off from Carthaginian supply lines, dependent on local resources and recruits, forced to maintain discipline among troops who had achieved everything that military science declared possible but found themselves no closer to ultimate victory, Hannibal faced problems that tactical genius alone could not solve. The very qualities that made his army effective in battle professional skill, international composition, loyalty to individual leadership, made it difficult to sustain during prolonged operations far from home base. The Roman strategy that emerged during this period of maximum crisis would later be known as Fabian tactics, after Quintus Fabius Maximus, the dictator who understood that Rome's best response to tactical inferiority was strategic patience. Instead of seeking decisive battles that played to Hannibal's strengths, Roman forces would shadow the Carthaginian army, harass its supply lines, and gradually erode its effectiveness through the kind of systematic pressure that could be maintained indefinitely by a power whose resources exceeded those of any individual enemy commander. The psychological transformation of Roman society during this period of extreme crisis created cultural changes that would outlast the military emergency that had provoked them. Romans who had grown up expecting automatic victory learned to value persistence over immediate success, systematic preparation over individual heroics, collective determination over personal ambition. The values that emerged from confronting Hannibal would later enable Roman conquests that surpassed anything achieved during the confident prosperity of earlier generations. As the seasons passed and Hannibal's presence in Italy became a familiar rather than shocking reality, both sides began to recognize that they were participants in a conflict that had transcended its original objectives to become something unprecedented in ancient experience. A total war that would test not just military capabilities, but the fundamental assumptions about power, politics, and cultural survival that underpinned Mediterranean civilization. The stage was set for developments that would reshape the ancient world in ways that neither victory nor defeat, in conventional terms, could adequately describe. In the marble halls of the Curia, where Roman senators had debated the affairs of their growing republic for generations, the autumn light filtering through high windows illuminated faces marked by a gravity that no previous crisis had demanded. The reports spread across the central table told a story that challenged every assumption upon which Roman confidence had been built. Hannibal controlled most of southern Italy, several major allies had defected to the Carthaginian cause, and the military forces available for continued resistance had been reduced to levels that made conventional victory seem impossible to achieve. The silence that preceded debate carried within it the weight of decisions that would determine not just the fate of Rome, but the entire future course of Mediterranean civilization. These senators had grown to political maturity during an era when Roman expansion had seemed as natural and inevitable as the changing of seasons. Now they faced choices that would test whether the values that had created Roman greatness could survive the supreme crisis that Hannibal's genius had created for their republic. The messenger who had brought Hannibal's terms for peace stood in the shadows beside marble columns, his presence a reminder that alternatives to continued warfare remained available for those willing to accept them. The terms themselves were not unreasonable by the standards of ancient diplomacy. Rome would abandon its claims to territories beyond Italy, pay substantial tribute to compensate Carthage for the costs of the war, and acknowledge Carthaginian supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. For a city that had lost 8 legions at Cannae and watched its Italian allies waver in their loyalty, these might have seemed acceptable conditions for survival. The debate that followed revealed the essential character of Roman civilization under pressure. Individual senators rose to speak with the knowledge that their words might determine whether their children would grow up as Roman citizens or Carthaginian subjects. The arguments they presented reflected not just political calculation, but fundamental questions about the nature of honor, duty, and the proper response to challenges that tested the limits of human endurance. The voices that echoed through that ancient chamber carried the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to value persistence over immediate gratification, long-term vision over short-term relief. Marcus Junius, whose own son had died at Cannae, spoke for those who saw continued resistance as moral necessity, regardless of practical considerations. His words carried the quiet intensity of grief transformed into determination. Rome had not survived for 5 centuries by accepting defeats as permanent, had not created its republic by surrendering difficult decisions to enemy pressure, had not earned the loyalty of Italian allies by abandoning them when loyalty demanded reciprocal sacrifice. The values that had created Roman greatness could not be preserved by abandoning them when their preservation required the greatest courage. The economic arguments that supported continued warfare revealed the depth of resources that Roman prosperity had accumulated during centuries of successful expansion. The treasury contained silver sufficient to field new armies. The Italian countryside could support extended military operations. The network of allies and colonies provided manpower reserves that exceeded anything Hannibal could draw from his increasingly isolated position in southern Italy. These material advantages would prove decisive only if Roman leadership possessed the moral courage to employ them, despite the human costs that continued warfare would inevitably demand. The religious dimensions of the senatorial debate reflected Roman understanding that their conflict with Hannibal involved more than territorial or commercial competition. The gods who had blessed Roman expansion, who had granted victory in previous wars, who had established Rome's destiny as the dominant power in Italy. These divine forces required human cooperation that could not be withdrawn when cooperation demanded supreme sacrifice. The auguries that guided Roman decision-making had not indicated that the gods had abandoned their chosen people, only that they were testing Roman worthiness to receive continued divine favor. The most profound moment in the debate came when Lucius Aemilius Paulus, whose brother had commanded one of the armies destroyed at Cannae, addressed the fundamental question of what it meant to be Roman when being Roman required choices that challenged human endurance. His argument transcended immediate military considerations to address the deeper issue of cultural survival. Rome existed not as a mere geographical location, but as a set of values and institutions that could be preserved only through the willingness to sacrifice everything else for their continuation. The decision that emerged from these deliberations was not reached through dramatic rhetoric or emotional appeals, but through the quiet accumulation of rational arguments that pointed toward a single conclusion. Rome possessed resources sufficient for continued resistance, values that demanded continued resistance, and institutional structures capable of organizing continued resistance despite losses that would have destroyed other ancient powers. The vote to reject Hannibal's peace terms was not an expression of mindless defiance, but a calculated judgment that Roman advantages in a prolonged conflict would eventually overcome Carthaginian advantages in tactical warfare. The practical measures that followed this decision demonstrated how Roman political institutions could translate abstract determination into concrete action. New levies were authorized that would conscript men previously exempt from military service. New taxes were imposed that would fund military operations on an unprecedented scale. New diplomatic initiatives were launched that would counter Carthaginian attempts to expand their Italian alliances. The machinery of Roman government, tested by crisis, proved capable of mobilizing resources that peacetime administration had never needed to access. The message that was sent to Hannibal reflected not just political decision but cultural statement. Rome would continue fighting regardless of cost, would accept no terms that implied acceptance of defeat. This was not bravado, but considered judgment based on realistic assessment of Roman capabilities and Carthaginian limitations. The psychological impact of this decision extended far beyond the immediate military situation to influence the entire subsequent development of Roman imperial policy. The precedent established during this crisis, that Rome would accept unlimited costs to avoid acknowledging defeat, would shape Roman responses to future challenges throughout the centuries of expansion that lay ahead. The willingness to sacrifice present comfort for future victory, to endure immediate suffering for long-term success, to maintain institutional unity despite individual losses, became defining characteristics of Roman imperial culture. As news of Rome's decisions spread throughout Italy and the broader Mediterranean world, it created psychological pressure that began to undermine Carthaginian strategic assumptions. Hannibal had demonstrated that he could destroy Roman armies with unprecedented efficiency, but he had not demonstrated that he could destroy the Roman system that produced those armies. His tactical genius had created military catastrophes for Rome, but it had not created the political collapse that military catastrophes were supposed to produce. The autumn evening that concluded this historic debate found Roman senators walking home through streets that had witnessed the daily life of their republic for generations, past temples where their ancestors had sought divine guidance, toward homes where their families waited for news that would determine whether those homes would remain Roman or become something else entirely. The decision they had made would test everything that Roman civilization represented, but it would test those values through action rather than abandoning them through surrender. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Roman officers planned the day's operations in camps scattered across Spain, a young commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio was developing approaches to warfare that would transform him from a promising general into the architect of Carthaginian defeat. But this transformation required more than military innovation. It demanded a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be Roman in a world where Roman traditional methods had proven insufficient to counter Carthaginian genius. Scipio's education in the realities of advanced warfare had begun at Cannae, where as a 17-year-old tribune he had witnessed the destruction of Roman tactical orthodoxy by methods that seemed to violate every principle of proper military organization. The experience of surviving that catastrophic defeat while watching experienced commanders prove helpless against Hannibal's innovations had planted seeds of strategic thinking that would flower during his Spanish campaigns into approaches that combined Roman systematic discipline with adaptations borrowed from every military tradition his armies encountered. The Spain that Scipio inherited as his theatre of operations represented Carthage at its most sophisticated, not merely a territorial possession but a carefully integrated network of military bases, agricultural resources, mining operations, and tribal alliances that provided the material foundation for Carthaginian resistance to Roman power. The Carthaginian commanders who controlled Spanish operations, Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, Hasdrubal Gisco, were products of the same military education that had created Hannibal, men whose tactical competence and strategic vision had enabled them to maintain Carthaginian power in Spain despite Roman efforts to disrupt their operations. The capture of New Carthage, Scipio's first major independent command, demonstrated his unique combination of Roman thoroughness with innovative tactical thinking that his enemies had not anticipated. The assault succeeded not through superior force but through superior intelligence gathering, careful preparation, and the kind of precise timing that transformed a heavily fortified city into a strategic prize captured with minimal casualties. The speed and efficiency of the operation announced to friend and enemy alike that Roman military leadership had evolved beyond the conventional methods that Hannibal had learned to counter so effectively. The treatment of prisoners and local populations that followed Scipio's Spanish victories revealed his deeper understanding of the political dimensions of warfare in an era when military success alone could not guarantee lasting victory. Where traditional Roman practice had emphasized harsh treatment designed to discourage resistance, Scipio developed policies that sought to convert former enemies into allies through generous terms that respected local customs and acknowledged the dignity of defeated opponents. This approach was not merely humanitarian but strategically sophisticated. It created loyalty that could not be purchased with silver or maintained through fear alone. The battles that established Scipio's reputation, Baecula, Ilipa, demonstrated his systematic study of Hannibalic tactics and his development of countermeasures that neutralized Carthaginian advantages without abandoning Roman strengths. At Baecula, Scipio's use of flexible formations and coordinated maneuvers showed that Romans could adapt their traditional discipline to the fluid requirements of advanced tactical warfare. At Ilipa, his employment of allied troops in coordination with Roman legions created combined arms capabilities that exceeded anything previous Roman commanders had achieved. The international character of Scipio's Spanish army reflected his recognition that warfare in the Mediterranean world of his era required cultural sophistication that transcended traditional Roman approaches to military organization. Spanish cavalry, whose ancestors had fought against Roman expansion, now served under Roman commanders who had learned to appreciate their unique skills. Numidian light troops, recruited from tribes that had previously supported Carthaginian operations, demonstrated that loyalty could be earned through competent leadership regardless of ethnic or cultural differences. The intelligence networks that supported Scipio's operations revealed his understanding that information gathering required the same systematic approach that Romans had traditionally applied to engineering and logistics. Spies who could pass as local merchants, diplomatic contacts who provided insights into enemy planning, reconnaissance missions that mapped terrain and enemy dispositions with scientific precision. All these elements combined to give Scipio strategic advantages that his tactical innovations could exploit effectively. The personal relationships that Scipio maintained with his subordinate commanders created a military culture that encouraged initiative while maintaining the disciplined coordination essential for complex operations. Roman officers serving under Scipio learned to balance traditional respect for authority with the kind of tactical flexibility that modern warfare demanded. This represented a significant evolution in Roman military culture, which had previously emphasized rigid adherence to established procedures over adaptation to changing circumstances. The siege techniques that Scipio developed during his Spanish campaigns combined traditional Roman engineering excellence with innovations borrowed from Greek and Carthaginian methods. The systematic approaches that reduced Spanish strongholds reflected not just superior equipment, but deeper understanding of the psychological factors that determined the outcome of prolonged sieges. Scipio had learned that capturing cities required not just breaking walls, but undermining the will of defenders to continue resistance. The diplomatic initiatives that accompanied Scipio's military operations demonstrated his recognition that lasting success required political achievements that military victory alone could not provide. Negotiations with Spanish tribes, agreements with former Carthaginian allies, treaties that established Roman influence without requiring permanent military occupation. These diplomatic successes laid foundations for Roman control that would outlast the immediate military emergency that had brought Roman armies to Spain. The logistical innovations that sustained Scipio's campaigns revealed his systematic approach to the practical challenges that determined the effectiveness of military operations. Supply systems that could maintain armies operating far from Roman bases, medical services that reduced casualty rates through improved treatment methods, communication networks that coordinated activities across vast distances. These organizational achievements were as crucial to Scipio's success as his tactical innovations. The cultural synthesis that characterized Scipio's approach to warfare represented something unprecedented in Roman military tradition, the integration of foreign methods and perspectives into Roman institutional structures without compromising the essential characteristics that made Roman organization effective. Scipio had learned to appreciate the value of non-Roman military techniques while maintaining the discipline and systematic thinking that remained Rome's greatest military assets. The decision to invade Africa, which would force the recall of Hannibal from Italy and create the conditions for final victory, demonstrated Scipio's strategic vision extending beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass the broader requirements for ending the war successfully. This was not merely a military operation, but a comprehensive challenge to the foundations of Carthaginian power, designed to force Carthaginian leadership to choose between defending their homeland and maintaining their Italian operations. The psychological warfare that accompanied Scipio's preparations for the African campaign revealed his understanding that modern warfare required attention to factors that extended far beyond battlefield tactics. The reputation that Scipio had established through his Spanish victories created expectations that influenced enemy morale and friendly recruitment. Carthaginian commanders faced the challenge of countering not just Roman military capabilities, but Roman confidence that had been restored through systematic success. The alliances that Scipio negotiated with African princes and tribal leaders demonstrated his appreciation of the political complexities that would determine the outcome of operations in Carthaginian territory. Massinissa and other Numidian leaders who joined the Roman cause provided not just military assistance, but political legitimacy that transformed Roman invasion from foreign conquest into civil war between competing visions of North African organization. The training methods that prepared Scipio's forces for African operations combined traditional Roman discipline with specialized techniques designed for warfare in unfamiliar terrain and climate. Roman legions learned to coordinate their movements with Numidian cavalry, to adapt their equipment for desert conditions, to modify their tactical formations for battles against enemies who employed different weapons and methods than European opponents. As Scipio's ships departed Spanish harbours for the African coast, they carried more than military equipment and soldiers. They carried the accumulated learning of a generation that had discovered how to combine Roman institutional strengths with tactical innovations, sophisticated enough to challenge Hannibal himself. The young commander, who had survived Cannae, had developed into a strategic artist capable of conceiving and executing operations that would test not just military skill, but the deepest foundations of Carthaginian power in its own homeland. The student was ready to face his teacher in the examination that would determine the future course of Mediterranean civilization. The African dawn that broke over the plains of Zama carried with it the weight of two civilizations preparing for an encounter that both commanders understood would determine far more than the outcome of a single battle. Hannibal, recalled from his Italian campaigns after 15 years of undefeated warfare, faced the young Roman general who had mastered his own tactical innovations and developed countermeasures that threatened to transform Carthaginian military superiority into historical memory. The silence that preceded this ultimate confrontation contained within it the accumulated tensions of a conflict that had already reshaped the ancient world beyond recognition. The armies that maneuvered for position across those North African fields represented the culmination of everything each civilization had learned about the organization of human violence for political purposes. Hannibal's forces combined veterans of Italian campaigns with fresh recruits whose training reflected a generation of military innovation forced by constant warfare against Roman persistence. Scipio's legions included soldiers who had learned their trade in Spanish battles against Carthaginian professionals, their discipline hardened by campaigns that had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of military skill when properly applied. The famous meeting between the two commanders before battle has been preserved by ancient historians as one of those rare moments when individual genius transcended immediate tactical concerns to address the broader human dimensions of conflict that would outlast any single war's resolution. These were not merely enemy generals exchanging ultimatums, but representatives of different approaches to civilization who recognized in each other the kind of excellence that commanded respect regardless of political allegiance. Their conversation, conducted in Greek that both had learned as part of their cosmopolitan education, acknowledged that their personal struggle had become larger than either of them, that they had become instruments of historical forces beyond individual control. The tactical deployments that preceded combat revealed how thoroughly each commander had studied his opponent's methods and developed responses designed to neutralize the advantages that had previously determined battlefield outcomes. Hannibal's arrangement of his forces reflected his understanding that he could no longer rely on tactical surprise to offset Roman numerical superiority, while Scipio's formations demonstrated his confidence that Roman discipline, properly directed, could overcome even the most sophisticated Carthaginian innovations. The war elephants that Hannibal employed at Zama carried symbolic weight far beyond their practical military value. These magnificent creatures, which had become synonymous with Carthaginian military power throughout the Mediterranean world, now faced Roman countermeasures that had been developed through years of systematic study and practical experience. The sight of elephants being turned back by Roman trumpet calls and javelin volleys marked not just tactical failure, but the symbolic defeat of methods that had once seemed to guarantee Carthaginian military supremacy. The cavalry action that developed on the flanks of the main battle revealed the political transformation that Scipio's diplomatic initiatives had accomplished in North African tribal relationships. Numidian horsemen who had previously served Carthaginian interests now charged against their former allies under Roman command, demonstrating how superior strategy could transform enemy advantages into friendly assets through patient negotiation and generous treatment of potential allies. The infantry combat that formed the battle's center tested everything that both civilizations had learned about organizing trained men for sustained combat under extreme pressure. Roman legions that had absorbed tactical innovations developed during Spanish campaigns faced Carthaginian professionals whose experience included every major engagement of the long war between their peoples. The clash of shield against shield, spear against spear, represented not just immediate tactical contest, but the ultimate test of institutional systems that had been refined through generations of conflict and adaptation. The tactical innovations that Scipio employed during the battle demonstrated his complete mastery of lessons learned through systematic study of Hannibalic methods. The gaps that he left in his formations to channel elephant charges, the reserve deployments that allowed him to reinforce threatened sectors while maintaining offensive pressure, the coordination of different troop types in combined operations that maximized each unit's effectiveness while minimizing its vulnerabilities. All these techniques showed that Roman military thinking had evolved far beyond the conventional methods that Hannibal had learned to defeat so effectively. The moment when Hannibal's carefully planned battle formations began to dissolve under Roman pressure marked not just tactical failure, but the recognition that individual genius, however extraordinary, could not overcome the systematic advantages that Roman institutional development had created. The army that had crossed the Alps, that had destroyed Roman legions with unprecedented efficiency, that had maintained itself in hostile territory for 15 years, finally encountered challenges that superior generalship alone could not master. The personal drama of the battle's conclusion, Hannibal's recognition that his tactical masterpiece had been countered by methods borrowed from his own innovations, embodied the broader irony of a conflict in which each side's greatest achievements created the conditions for its ultimate limitations. The commander who had taught the ancient world new possibilities for military excellence discovered that his own lessons, when properly learned and systematically applied, could be turned against their originator with decisive effect. The casualties that covered the Zama battlefield represented more than military losses. They marked the end of an era when individual tactical genius could determine the outcome of conflicts between major powers. The age that was ending with this battle had been characterized by commanders whose personal innovations could overcome institutional advantages, whose creative adaptations of established methods could surprise and defeat enemies who relied on conventional approaches. The age that was beginning would be characterized by systematic organization, institutional memory, and the kind of collective competence that could absorb and counter individual brilliance through superior resources and patient preparation. The pursuit that followed Carthaginian defeat demonstrated Roman understanding that lasting victory required not just battlefield success, but the kind of systematic follow-up that would prevent enemy recovery and future resistance. The disciplined advance that prevented Hannibal's forces from regrouping, the capture of strategic positions that controlled future military operations, the political initiatives that converted military victory into administrative control. All these measures revealed how thoroughly Roman strategic thinking had evolved beyond the conventional approaches that had characterized earlier phases of the war. The diplomatic negotiations that ended the battle were conducted with the mutual respect between professional soldiers who recognized that their personal conflict had been conducted according to standards of military excellence that transcended immediate political differences. Hannibal's acknowledgement of defeat and Scipio's generous treatment of his defeated opponent established precedents for civilized warfare that would influence military conduct throughout the subsequent development of Mediterranean civilization. The message that announced Roman victory to the Senate and people of Rome carried news that transcended immediate military success to encompass the beginning of a new era in Mediterranean history. The threat that had challenged Roman existence for nearly 2 decades had been eliminated through methods that demonstrated Roman capacity for adaptation, learning, and the systematic application of accumulated knowledge to complex challenges. The civilization that emerged from the supreme test possessed confidence and capabilities that would reshape the known world during the centuries of expansion that lay ahead. As the sun set over the Zama battlefield, its light reflected off discarded weapons and abandoned equipment that told the story of human conflict transformed from desperate struggle for survival into systematic demonstration of institutional superiority. The two commanders who had personified their civilization's approaches to warfare had completed their examination of each other's methods and determined, through the most rigorous possible test, which approach offered greater promise for lasting success in the complex world that their struggle had created. The age of Hannibal was ending, but the age of Rome was just beginning. The Rome that celebrated Scipio's triumph was no longer the modest republic of farmers and shepherds that had first gazed across the Mediterranean with tentative ambition. Victory over Carthage had transformed Roman civilization in ways both obvious and subtle, creating capabilities and responsibilities that previous generations of Roman leaders had never imagined they would need to master. The silver that filled Roman treasuries came not just from Carthaginian tribute, but from Spanish mines whose productivity revealed the material possibilities of systematic imperial administration. The skills that Roman administrators were learning to manage conquered territories would soon be applied to provinces spanning 3 continents. The psychological transformation of Roman society proved even more significant than its material enrichment. Citizens who had grown to maturity during the long struggle with Hannibal had learned to think of their republic not as one Italian power among many, but as the dominant force in Mediterranean civilization, destined by divine favor and human excellence to impose Roman order on a world that clearly needed Roman organization. This expanded sense of mission would drive Roman expansion long after the immediate security concerns that had motivated the Punic Wars had been resolved through complete victory. The military innovations that had enabled victory over Carthage created institutional capabilities that demanded continued employment lest they atrophy through disuse. Roman legions that had mastered the coordination of different fighting styles, Roman engineers who had learned to adapt their techniques to diverse geographical challenges, Roman commanders who had developed skills in managing complex international operations. These human resources represented investments that could be recovered only through applications that matched their sophisticated capabilities to appropriate challenges. The diplomatic methods that had converted enemy allies into Roman supporters during the struggle with Carthage established patterns that would characterize Roman imperial expansion for centuries. The generous treatment of defeated opponents, the integration of foreign military techniques into Roman tactical systems, the systematic cultivation of local leaders who could serve as intermediaries between Roman authority and indigenous populations. These approaches had proven their effectiveness during the Punic Wars and would be refined and extended during the conquests that followed. The fate of Hannibal in exile embodied the broader historical transition that Roman victory had accomplished. The greatest military genius of his generation spent his final years as a fugitive, dependent on the hospitality of Eastern kingdoms, whose own independence was increasingly threatened by Roman expansion. His suicide in Bithynia, when Roman diplomatic pressure made his position untenable even among former allies, symbolized the end of an era when individual excellence could challenge institutional power successfully. The world that was emerging from the Punic Wars would be characterized by systematic organization rather than personal achievement, collective competence rather than individual brilliance. The transformation of Carthage itself from commercial rival to client state demonstrated how thoroughly Roman victory had altered the balance of Mediterranean power. The city that had once challenged Rome for dominance of the ancient world now survived only through Roman tolerance, its commercial activities subject to Roman supervision, its political decisions constrained by Roman interests. The harbour installations that had once sheltered fleets capable of challenging Roman naval power were reduced to accommodating merchant vessels whose cargoes enriched Roman rather than Carthaginian treasuries. The cultural changes that accompanied Roman political expansion revealed how victory in the Punic Wars had prepared Roman civilization for roles that its traditional values had not anticipated. Romans who had learned to appreciate Greek philosophy through their Mediterranean campaigns, Roman artists who had absorbed techniques developed in Carthaginian workshops, Roman merchants who had mastered trading methods perfected through generations of Punic commercial experience. All these cultural adaptations enriched Roman civilization while gradually transforming its essential character. The roads that connected Roman territories throughout the Mediterranean served not just military and administrative functions, but psychological purposes that reinforced the unity of an empire whose diversity might otherwise have encouraged fragmentation. Veterans of Punic War campaigns who settled in Spanish colonies could travel to African provinces over highways that reminded them of their common Roman identity, while maintaining connections with Italian communities whose support had made their victories possible. These physical links created the infrastructure for cultural unity that would outlast the immediate political arrangements that had created it. The languages that Romans encountered during their expansion beyond Italy reflected the linguistic diversity of Mediterranean civilization, but they also revealed how Roman administrative methods could accommodate difference while maintaining unified control. Latin, which had begun as the local dialect of a central Italian tribe, was evolving into the common tongue of international diplomacy and commercial communication. Yet Roman policy encouraged the preservation of local languages for regional use, creating linguistic diversity within imperial unity that would characterize Roman administration throughout its subsequent development. The religious practices that Romans adopted during their Mediterranean expansion demonstrated how victory over Carthage had opened Roman culture to influences that traditional Roman conservatism might have rejected under different circumstances. Egyptian mystery religions, Greek philosophical schools, even modified versions of Carthaginian worship practices, found places within the expanding pantheon of Roman spiritual life. This religious syncretism created the cultural foundation for an imperial civilization that could accommodate the beliefs and practices of dozens of different peoples within a single political framework. The economic systems that emerged from Roman victory created commercial networks that surpassed anything the ancient world had previously achieved. Roman merchants, protected by Roman military power and supported by Roman legal institutions, could conduct business across distances that earlier generations had found commercially prohibitive. The standardization of currency, measurements, and legal procedures that Roman administration imposed throughout its territories reduced transaction costs while creating market opportunities that benefited both Roman entrepreneurs and local producers. The educational developments that accompanied Roman imperial expansion reflected the growing recognition that governing diverse populations required intellectual skills that traditional Roman education had not emphasized. Roman administrators learned to study local customs, master foreign languages, and adapt Roman legal principles to circumstances that Roman jurisprudence had not originally anticipated. These educational innovations created the intellectual foundation for imperial administration while enriching Roman culture through exposure to traditions and ideas from throughout the ancient world. The architectural achievements that marked Roman expansion beyond Italy combined practical functionality with symbolic assertion of Roman power and permanence. The temples, forums, aqueducts, and amphitheatres that Romans constructed in their new territories served immediate administrative and commercial needs, while demonstrating to local populations the superior organizational capabilities that justified Roman political control. These building projects created employment for local craftsmen, while introducing construction techniques that improved urban living conditions throughout the Roman world. The legal innovations that Romans developed to govern their expanded territories established jurisprudential principles that would influence Western legal thinking for millennia. The law of nations that emerged from Roman attempts to adjudicate disputes between peoples with different legal traditions created precedents for international law, while Roman civil law provided models for legal systems that balanced individual rights with collective welfare. These legal achievements represented one of Rome's most lasting contributions to human civilization, outlasting the political institutions that had created them. As the generation that had witnessed Hannibal's invasion settled into the comfortable prosperity that victory had made possible, few Romans could have anticipated that their triumph over Carthage had initiated processes of expansion and cultural transformation that would continue for centuries, ultimately creating an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia and lasted for more than 1,000 years. The seeds planted during the Punic Wars would flower into achievements that surpassed anything their planters had imagined possible. 50 years after Scipio's triumph at Zama, the morning sun that rose over the rebuilt walls of Carthage illuminated a city that had transformed itself from defeated enemy into prosperous trading partner. Its harbours once again busy with commercial vessels, its markets filled with goods from across the Mediterranean, its schools and libraries rivaling those of Athens and Alexandria. Yet this renaissance, born from Carthaginian resilience and Roman tolerance, would prove tragically temporary, destroyed not by military necessity, but by the kind of fear that great powers often develop when their dominance becomes so complete that any potential challenge seems intolerable. The Third Punic War began not with grand strategic objectives or compelling military requirements, but with the systematic cultivation of Roman paranoia by politicians who had discovered that fear of Carthaginian resurgence could be harvested for domestic political advantage. Marcus Porcius Cato, whose famous declaration that Carthage must be destroyed concluded every speech he delivered in the Roman Senate, represented a generation of Roman leaders who had inherited imperial power but not the wisdom to use it responsibly. These were men who had never faced genuine threats to Roman security, but had learned to perceive potential challenges as actual dangers requiring preemptive elimination. The pretext for this final war, a territorial dispute between Carthage and Masiniss's Numidian kingdom, revealed how thoroughly Roman strategic thinking had been corrupted by the intoxication of absolute power. Where previous generations of Roman leaders had sought to balance competing interests through diplomatic mediation, the senators who declared war on Carthage in 49 BCE were no longer interested in peaceful resolution of disputes that could be settled through applications of overwhelming force. The legal technicalities that justified Roman military intervention masked imperial ambitions that had transcended any reasonable definition of defensive necessity. The Carthaginian response to Roman ultimatums demonstrated the pathetic position of a civilization that had rebuilt itself only to discover that its former enemy no longer tolerated even peaceful competition. The surrender of weapons, the delivery of hostages, the acceptance of Roman supervision over Carthaginian foreign relations, All these concessions proved insufficient to satisfy Roman demands that escalated beyond any rational proportion to genuine security requirements. When Roman commanders finally announced that Carthage itself must be destroyed and its population relocated far from the Mediterranean coast, Carthaginian leaders faced the recognition that Roman policy had moved beyond diplomatic pressure into the realm of civilizational elimination. The siege that followed this diplomatic breakdown stretched across 3 years of systematic destruction that revealed how Roman military capabilities had evolved since the heroic struggles of the Punic Wars. The engineering techniques that reduced Carthaginian fortifications, the blockade methods that isolated the city from external support, the assault tactics that overcame desperate resistance. All these operations demonstrated Roman institutional competence applied to tasks that required technical skill but little strategic imagination. This was not warfare between equals, but the methodical elimination of a defeated opponent whose continued existence had become politically inconvenient. The resistance that Carthaginians offered during their city's final siege embodied the kind of desperate courage that emerges when people face choices between honorable death and ignominious survival. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings, children carried stones to defenders on the walls, elderly scholars burned their libraries rather than see their accumulated wisdom fall into Roman hands. This was not military resistance in any conventional sense, but civilizational suicide, chosen as preferable to the cultural extinction that Roman victory would impose. Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman commander who presided over Carthage's destruction, represented the tragic evolution of Roman leadership from the generous pragmatism of his adoptive grandfather to the systematic ruthlessness of imperial administration. His tears, as he watched the flames consume buildings where Carthaginian philosophers had once debated questions of justice and virtue, revealed his recognition that Roman victory in this final war diminished rather than enhanced Roman greatness. The destruction of Carthage marked not the triumph of Roman values, but their corruption by power that had exceeded the moral constraints that had originally justified its exercise. The fires that consumed Carthaginian libraries destroyed more than individual manuscripts. They eliminated centuries of accumulated knowledge in fields ranging from navigation and agriculture to astronomy and medicine. Carthaginian innovations in urban planning, hydraulic engineering, and commercial law that might have enriched Mediterranean civilization were lost forever, their contributions to human progress sacrificed to Roman fears that proved entirely imaginary. The intellectual poverty that followed Carthage's destruction impoverished the ancient world in ways that military defeat could never have accomplished. The salt that Romans allegedly sowed in Carthaginian fields has become legendary as a symbol of destruction so complete that it prevented any possibility of recovery. Though modern historians question whether this dramatic gesture actually occurred. Whether literal or metaphorical, the image captures the essential character of Roman policy during this final war, the determination to eliminate not just political opposition, but the very possibility of future competition from sources that had once challenged Roman hegemony. The precedent established by Carthage's destruction would influence Roman treatment of other potential rivals throughout the subsequent centuries of imperial expansion. The complete elimination of opponents who possessed capabilities that might theoretically threaten Roman interests became standard policy, applied to Celtic tribes in Gaul, Germanic peoples along the Rhine frontier, and Jewish communities that refused to accept Roman cultural hegemony. The methods perfected during the final destruction of Carthage became templates for imperial actions that prioritized Roman security over justice, immediate advantage over long-term stability. As the smoke from Carthage's funeral pyre drifted across Mediterranean waters that had once carried the ships of two great civilizations engaged in honorable competition, it carried with it more than the remains of buildings and human bodies. It marked the end of an era when Rome had been one power among many, constrained by the existence of worthy rivals who demanded respect even in defeat. The age that was beginning would be characterized by Roman dominance so complete that potential challenges could be eliminated before they developed into actual threats, creating the imperial loneliness that would eventually contribute to Rome's own decline and fall. In the gentle twilight that settles over modern cities from London to Los Angeles, the shadows cast by electric streetlights follow patterns established by Roman urban planners who learned their skills during the wars with Carthage. The legal documents that govern our daily transactions, mortgages, contracts, incorporation papers, employ principles of jurisprudence that emerged from Roman attempts to manage the complex relationships between peoples whose different traditions had to be reconciled within a single political framework. The languages we speak carry within their vocabulary and grammar the linguistic heritage of a civilization that discovered during its Punic struggles how to communicate across cultural boundaries while maintaining institutional unity. The roads that connect our modern communities follow routes pioneered by Roman engineers whose techniques were refined during the urgent necessity of moving armies rapidly across territories where speed often determined the difference between victory and defeat. The concrete that supports our bridges and buildings employs chemical knowledge that Roman technicians developed while constructing harbours and fortifications capable of withstanding both military assault and the patient erosion of Mediterranean weather. Even the postal systems that carry our correspondence operate according to organisational principles that Romans perfected while coordinating military operations across distances that had previously made unified command impossible. The universities where our children learn to think critically about complex problems trace their intellectual lineage to educational institutions that Romans established throughout their empire, places where different cultural traditions encountered each other in contexts that encouraged synthesis rather than conflict. The scientific methods that guide our understanding of natural phenomena descend from Greek theoretical insights that were preserved and transmitted by Roman scholars who had learned to appreciate intellectual achievements regardless of their ethnic or political origins. The historical consciousness that allows us to learn from past experience reflects Roman innovations in recording and analysing human events that had previously been preserved only through oral tradition. The democratic institutions that govern our political life, despite their immediate derivation from more recent historical developments, ultimately rest upon Roman innovations in representative government, federal organisation, and the balance between individual rights and collective welfare. The concept of citizenship that defines our relationship to political authority descends from Roman legal theory that emerged during the Punic Wars, when Romans first learned to integrate conquered peoples into their system without destroying the cultural diversity that enriched their imperial civilization. The international law that governs relationships between modern nations employs principles that Roman jurists developed while adjudicating disputes between peoples whose different legal traditions required synthesis into universally applicable standards. The architectural spaces where we work, worship, and entertain ourselves reflect design principles that Roman builders perfected while constructing public buildings capable of serving diverse populations whose cultural expectations had to be accommodated within unified aesthetic frameworks. The engineering systems that supply our cities with fresh water and remove waste products operate according to hydraulic principles that Roman technicians mastered while serving populations whose health and comfort depended on sanitary infrastructure that exceeded anything the ancient world had previously achieved. The military organizations that defend our modern nations employ strategic concepts that emerged from Roman analysis of what made some armies more effective than others in achieving political objectives through organized violence. The logistics systems that supply modern armed forces with equipment and provisions descend from Roman innovations in moving, feeding, and equipping large numbers of men operating far from their home bases for extended periods. The intelligence methods that modern governments use to understand potential threats and opportunities reflect Roman discoveries about the systematic collection and analysis of information as tools for strategic decision-making. The commercial practices that govern international trade, banking, insurance, standardized currencies, legal frameworks for dispute resolution all descend from Roman innovations that emerged during their transformation from a local Italian power into the dominant force in Mediterranean commerce. The accounting methods that businesses use to track income and expenditures, the legal structures that govern corporate organization, even the architectural layouts of modern office buildings reflect Roman solutions to problems of managing complex economic activities across vast distances and diverse cultural contexts. The entertainment that fills our leisure hours often employs narrative structures and dramatic techniques that were perfected by Roman authors who had absorbed Greek theoretical insights while adapting them to serve the cultural needs of their own more practically oriented civilization. The sports competitions that provide modern recreation follow organizational patterns that Romans developed while creating public entertainments that could satisfy diverse populations whose different cultural backgrounds required accommodation within unified institutional frameworks. The medical knowledge that maintains our health includes techniques and observations that were preserved through Roman institutions during periods when other civilizations lost the scientific achievements of earlier generations. The agricultural methods that feed our modern populations employ crop rotation, soil management, and selective breeding techniques that Roman farmers perfected while supplying the food requirements of urban populations whose size exceeded anything the ancient world had previously attempted to sustain. Perhaps most importantly, the very concept of progress, the belief that human societies can learn from experience and create better conditions for future generations, reflects Roman confidence in the power of systematic effort and institutional memory to overcome challenges that had previously seemed insurmountable. The optimism that characterizes modern civilization, despite its frequent disappointments and setbacks, ultimately descends from Roman discoveries that persistent effort guided by rational analysis could transform apparently impossible dreams into accomplished realities. As we drift towards sleep in our modern homes, surrounded by the accumulated conveniences that human ingenuity has created over centuries of patient development, we rest upon foundations that were laid by people who discovered during their struggles with worthy opponents that the greatest human achievements often emerge from the most demanding challenges, that lasting success requires not the elimination of competition, but the wisdom to learn from it, and that civilizations, like individuals, grow strongest when they are tested by difficulties that demand their very best responses. As Mediterranean waves continue their eternal rhythm against shores that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the gentle sound they make carries echoes of all the human dreams that have been launched upon those waters, dreams of conquest and commerce, of glory and survival, of the endless human search for security in a world where change remains the only constant. The same moonlight that illuminated Roman galleys and Carthaginian merchantmen now shines upon vessels carrying different cargoes toward different destinations, but the fundamental human stories remain remarkably unchanged across the centuries that separate our age from theirs. The ambitions that drove Romans and Carthaginians to transform their local conflicts into civilizational struggles continue to shape our modern world, though they now operate through different institutions and employ different technologies. The desire for security that motivated Roman expansion beyond Italy now influences nations whose power extends across oceans that ancient peoples could barely imagine, while the commercial networks that made Carthaginian prosperity possible have evolved into global economic systems that connect every continent through relationships that would have seemed magical to ancient merchants. The lessons embedded in the Punic Wars speak to challenges that transcend any particular historical period. How do civilizations balance the requirements of security with the values that make security worth preserving? How do peoples who have learned to compete successfully avoid destroying what they claim to be protecting? How do societies maintain their essential character while adapting to circumstances that their founders never anticipated they would encounter? The ruins scattered across North Africa and southern Europe, broken columns that once supported temples, fragments of walls that once protected harbours, traces of roads that once carried the commerce of 3 continents, remind us that even the most powerful human achievements are temporary, but they also demonstrate that the knowledge and values preserved through such achievements can endure far longer than the stones and bronze that gave them physical form. The legal principles that Romans developed, the urban planning techniques that improved Mediterranean cities, the philosophical insights that emerged from cultural encounters between different traditions, these intellectual achievements have outlasted the political institutions that created them. The story of Hannibal and Scipio, of Rome and Carthage, continues to resonate because it embodies eternal truths about human nature that remain relevant regardless of technological or political changes. The courage required to attempt what conventional wisdom declares impossible, the patience necessary to recover from devastating setbacks, the wisdom needed to transform enemies into allies. These qualities that determined the outcome of ancient struggles remain essential for addressing the challenges that confront our own generation. The Mediterranean world that emerged from the Punic Wars created the foundation for developments that eventually produced the civilization we inhabit today, but it also demonstrated patterns of historical change that continue to influence how societies rise, compete, adapt, and sometimes fail to adapt to changing circumstances. The global nature of our modern challenges requires the same kind of long-term thinking, systematic preparation, and cultural flexibility that enabled Romans to survive Hannibal's invasion and eventually create an empire that lasted for centuries. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Punic Wars lies in their demonstration that the greatest human achievements often emerge from the most dangerous crises, that civilizations develop their most admirable characteristics when they are tested by opponents worthy of their best efforts, and that lasting success requires not the elimination of competition, but the wisdom to learn from it. The Roman virtues that enabled victory over Carthage, persistence, adaptability, the capacity to integrate rather than destroy, remain relevant for any society that hopes to achieve lasting success in a world where change and challenge are permanent features of the human condition. As we settle into sleep, surrounded by the accumulated achievements of centuries of human effort, we can find comfort in the knowledge that our predecessors faced challenges that seemed equally insurmountable and discovered resources of strength and wisdom that enabled not just survival, but the creation of foundations upon which subsequent generations could build even greater achievements. The gentle voices from the past continue to offer guidance for those patient enough to listen to their whispered wisdom carried on Mediterranean breezes that connect all human generations in the endless story of our species' journey toward understanding, compassion, and the creation of beauty that can outlast the civilizations that brought it into being.